Holy Mother of the Church teaches her children the teachings of Christ through an instrument which is called the Divine Liturgy. The Divine Liturgy are all the mysteries of the teachings of the Church, which we see in a scene called the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. It is sad that our separated brothers have given away all the liturgies that they used to have, and so their prayers right now, their rituals are devoid of liturgy and therefore devoid of mystery. The very liturgy of the Catholic Church is enveloped by mystery because religion is something to be wondered at. It is mysterious, it is awesome. It is going into the realm of the divine. That's why it must be covered by means of liturgical gestures. Now, during the season of Lent, and especially during Holy Week, the main lesson that the Catholic Church is teaching us through the liturgy is the meaning of suffering, the role of suffering in the Catholic Church. You see, the liturgical year of the Catholic Church begins with Advent, wherein we prepare ourselves, the soil, so that the Word of God, when it comes to our soul, may grow in a fertile environment. And then it goes on. The most important, of course, is Lent. And within Lent is Holy Week. And the main message of the Church, the lesson she's giving us is how to suffer. Suffering is essential to the Catholic Church. It is the handmaiden of the Catholic Church. It has to go hand in hand with the Catholic Church. When the Catholic Church was at its earliest stage, she was surrounded by sufferings. There were persecutions, and that was the time we had so many martyrs. And as the Catholic Church grew in her history, you will notice one thing, that when she is persecuted, she grows vibrant and she acquires many members. But if she becomes complacent because she becomes rich and worldly, now that's the time that the Catholic Church is filled with heresies. It is said that suffering is the handmaiden of the Church. Suffering is like the heart. It is the heart of the Church. The heart of a man, it is said, is the one that enlivens by means of sending blood to all parts of the body. It enlivens the whole body of a man. And so a man is kept alive by the pumping of the heart, which nourishes the brains, the eyes, the ears, the body, and so on. Well, suffering is like the heart of the Church. As long as there is suffering, the Church is enlivened and completely nourished. And the same thing goes with every single Christian. That when there is suffering, every single soul becomes vibrant. The whole body is nourished, and he becomes truly a good Christian. Just as when the heart of a man stops, he dies. When the Church stops suffering spiritually, she dies. And when a person stops suffering, he also spiritually dies. That's the reason why it is so important that the Catholic Church in all her history should always have sufferings, and she always truly suffered, precisely because it is only when the Church is like her Master, Christ, a suffering Master, it is only when we, each one of us, is like the Church and Christ, a suffering soul, can we truly say we are true followers of Christ. We can say that there are two views from the cross. One is down, looking up to the cross, and one is hanging on the cross and looking down. The first one was possible in the Old Testament and represented by the Jewish people who were beaten by snakes. And so they had to look up to be saved. And if they didn't look up, they would have died because of the bites of the snake. And the other one is in the New Testament, by which Christ has taught us how to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Him, meaning to say we have to be crucified with Him so we can see the world from the view of the cross, hanging on the cross with Jesus Christ. Now, the second view was not attainable during the Old Testament because they did not know yet how to deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow Christ. But it was possible in the New Testament. And so during the Old Testament, if we still stay down on the ground and look up to the cross, then we shall have the wrong view of the entire world. A great number of people live and die without reflecting on the things that are around them. They do not think, they do not reason, they do not try to analyze what is happening around them. And if by accident somebody sits down and think and try to analyze with his mind what is going around him, he will be confused. He will find himself as if in a maze and will not be able to understand the happenings around him. In the New Testament, the view from the cross, which means we have to be crucified with Christ on the cross, is what integrates everything, put them together, and give meaning to all the things that are happening around us. It is the cross that gives value to all the things of the world. Whether it is money or rank, ambition, pleasure, excitements, or so on, it is the cross that has given them value. 1 for this, 3 for this, and 0 for this. And so with the cross, a person will view the world in its proper aspect. Of course, no one would like to view the world from the cross or hanging on the cross, because right down there, the whole world looks sunnier and brighter and even more enjoyable. But from the cross, the whole world seems to be a big mess. It is the cause why Christ is hanging on the cross, meaning to say, it is this world that have caused the crucifixion of Christ because mankind had always chosen the world. So the view of the world from the cross is a sad view because it is the view of sin and the cause why God was crucified. And so man, when he is down the cross, cannot really judge things correctly or objectively. In fact, the morality of man simply consists in this: when something happens that I like, it's good. If something happens that I don't like, it's bad. If something is good for me, it's good. And if something is bad for me, it's bad. Now, that is a very relative way of judging morality because you're using your own pleasure, individual vested interest as your criterion for judging everything around you. Now, since the judgment of man differ from one another, can you imagine what chaos can take place around the world? When Christ came into the world and died for us on the cross, He disarranged all the order in the world. As they said, He removed the fruit from the eater and the enjoyment from the enjoyer. Now the cross is a secret wisdom. To suffer correctly and to suffer like Christ is a deep secret wisdom that is given only to a few. You cannot teach it to one another. Each one has to learn it by himself. And because this is a secret wisdom, each Catholic who is truly suffering for the sake of Christ outwardly has to look natural, going towards his everyday routine as if nothing is happening. But inside, he is slowly being crucified. Never show your crucifixion in public. It has something to be internal, hidden, where God alone sees you. In the Garden of Paradise, Adam and Eve were tested by God. God placed in the Garden of Eden 2 trees, a tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God actually told Adam and Eve to eat first of the tree of life and afterwards of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life is the cross. We have to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Christ, hanging on the cross to have a sharing in His life. That is the tree of life. Now, the test of Adam and Eve was that they were presented with a tree, which is good, which is nice to see in the eyes, but it was forbidden. Now, that's the view from the cross, in that you are hanging on the cross and the world around you is good to see and good to eat, but it is a forbidden fruit. We are not allowed to touch it. So what happened to Eve was, it was within her reach, and because it was good to see, she reached out and touched it. So the same thing with you. The view on the cross is this: the world looks nice and good to eat, but don't touch it. First, you have to be crucified on the cross. Then later, you can touch it without doing you any harm. How can we know that a church is the true church of Christ, and how can we know if a person is a true follower of Christ? It's quite easy. The church of Christ is the church that teaches like Christ, that teaches exactly the things that Christ taught. The church should suffer the way Christ suffered. It must have an excellence of life which is similar to Christ and should be misunderstood like Christ. I mean, if the church is so different from the life of its master, how can you say that this is the true church? And so the same thing goes with its follower. How can we know that we are true followers of Christ? Well, that we should teach and speak the way Christ spoke and taught, that we must suffer exactly like Christ. We must have an excellence of life which is exactly like Christ, and we must be misunderstood exactly like Christ. When the baby Christ, Jesus, was brought to the temple, Simeon went there and prophesied that Jesus Christ would be a sign of contradiction. So if Christ is a sign of contradiction, His church must be a sign of contradiction, and His followers must also be a sign of contradiction. And in these short talks, I will show you 6 signs of contradiction that Christ showed to us in Scripture, and which each one of us and which our Catholic Church should also exhibit. And these are signs, meaning to say it's tangible. You can perceive it, you can see it, but it is because it's tangible a great proof that the church and this particular person is a follower of Christ. We have just seen three descriptions of the life of Christ which His church and every true follower must have. And the first one is suffering. The second is excellence of life. And third, false accusations. Indeed, Christ, even from the time He was born, suffered so much. As a babe, He had to flee to Egypt. That was most uncomfortable. And the Catholic Church, at its beginning, suffered so much also. And so there is a similarity with the early church. Now let us ask this question. Our church today, here and now, is she suffering in exactly the same way? Or is she honored in all ways and entertained in all ways and honored and owed and given gifts? Well, she's beginning to be more unlike Christ than like Christ. Secondly, Christ showed excellence of life in the sense that when He was being persecuted as a babe, He showed great patience. And so the same thing with the early church, the Christians, even if they were being persecuted, they were so patient towards their persecutor that you will never hear of any Christian community rebelling or going on a strike against an emperor. But at the same time, they showed excellence of life. The pagans used to look at the Christian community and say, "See how they love one another." And in spite of their excellence of life, like Christ, they were criticized and falsely accused. Our suffering, our excellence of life, and our false accusations that are thrown upon us will depend on how close you are with Christ. The more sufferings, the more accusations, the more excellence of life, the more you are like Christ. And the less suffering, and the less excellence of life, and the less accusations, the more you are unlike Christ. The first sign of contradiction that was hurled at Christ is that He was a deceiver, though preaching the truth. Now this you will notice is a contradiction, that He was called a deceiver while He was preaching the truth. And so the Catholic Church at the beginning was also accused as a deceiver while teaching the truth. All the lives of the saints show exactly the same thing. When St. Ignatius was preaching during the time of the Reformation, he was called by the Dominicans as a deceiver. And the same thing with John Bosco by his own bishop as a deceiver. And so you notice that Christ was called a deceiver by His own people, not by pagans outside His religion, but by His own people and by His own priests and high priests. And that precisely is what happened to the saints. Don Bosco was accused by his own bishop. Saint Joan of Arc was accused as a deceiver also by a bishop, Bishop Caujon. So you see, today, if you are a true follower of Christ, you must also show this sign of contradiction, meaning to say, you should be preaching the truth, as taken from the fathers of the church, and called a deceiver, not by outsiders, but by your fellow Catholics, and also be called a deceiver by your priests and high priests. When Christ was on earth, there were three reactions towards Him. His friends called Him mad. His disciples called him the Son of the living God. And the Pharisees could not accuse him of anything. If they chose that he was mad, they couldn't quite use it because Christ was more popular than them. They could not also use that he was the Son of the living God because that would confirm precisely what Christ was trying to use. So they had to invent something in the middle, and they discovered the word deceiver, that Christ was a deceiver. Now, when somebody is a deceiver, he must have a motive for it. Now, what was the motive of Christ for deceiving the people? Christ had no political ambition, so why will he deceive? Only politicians deceive others. He had no desire to be rich, so why should he deceive? For more often, rich people are the ones who would like to deceive to earn more money for their avarice. And so they could not find any reason for accusing him, a motive for him to be a deceiver. When the Pharisees went to Pontius Pilate, they accused Christ. He is a deceiver, they said. And then they accused Christ when Pontius Pilate says, why? What did he say? And they said, he called himself the King of the Jews, which Christ never said. And so you see, the Pharisees who were calling Christ a deceiver were the ones who were deceiving. Today, only if you teach the Catholic truth as taken from the writings of the Fathers of the Church will people call you a deceiver. It always goes hand in hand. When you're teaching the truth, you are called a deceiver. Now, if people are not calling you deceiver, they're not. In fact, they respect you and listen to you and show you adulation, probably you are not teaching the truth. We must all study the fullness of the teachings of the Catholic Church, and we must try to find out all the attacks that are thrown at us wherein they call us deceivers. And we should refute every accusations that they throw at us. But in spite of the fact that we answer all their accusations, we shall still be called deceivers. Why? Because that is how they exactly treated our Master, Jesus Christ. This is what it means to be a Catholic, to be called a deceiver by our co-members and the high priest. And again, the more you're called a deceiver, the more you are like Christ, and the more you are a follower of Christ. And the less you are called a deceiver and may be accepted and praised by those around you, the more you are unlike Christ and probably following someone else, but definitely not Christ. God bless you.